Chapter 19. Early Latin America. In September 1589, Captain Mancio Serra de Leguizamon de Leguizamon lay dying in his bed in Cusco, the ancient capital of the Incas in the highlands of Peru. His mind was still clear, but his body was failing, and he knew his time was approaching. He needed to set his affairs in order with his heirs, his king, and God. He called a priest and a notary to his bedside to draw up his last will and testament. Born in Castile, like many young Spanish men he had been attracted to the New World by its fabled wealth and opportunities for advancement. While he was 16, he sailed for the New World in search of adventure. Sometime in 1532, he joined the 168 men under the Spanish conqueror Francisco Pizarro, who were embarked on the conquest of the Inca Empire. Mancio Serra claimed at his will that he was the first Spaniard to enter Cusco when the Spaniards laid siege to the city in 1533. Legend has it that in the looting that followed, he seized a great golden disc representing the sun that he had flung on the walls of the principal temple of the sun in Cusco. But that very night he fell to drinking and gambling and lost the treasure. He never got over his love of gambling. But all was not lost with this disc of gold. For his effort, Mancio received grants of Indian laborers and a site in the city where, using an Inca stonework foundation, he built a fine home. There were more expeditions, civil wars, an Indian mistress, a marriage to an Inca noblewoman, and later to Spanish women, figure 19.1. There were numerous children, some legitimate and some not. Mancio Serra became a respected leader in Peru, for while mayor of Cusco, a man of substance with many servants and slaves. But unlike many of the Spaniards involved in conquest, on his deathbed, Mancio Serra, overcome by his guilt, had second thoughts about the justice of what he had done. Before assigning his property to heirs, calling himself the last of the conquerors still alive, and so the last who could give eyewitness testimony, in his will he addressed the King of Spain. We found these realms in such order that there were not a thief, nor a vicious man, nor an adulteress, nor were there prostitutes, nor were there immortal people, each being content and honest in their labor, and that their lands, forests, mines, pastures, and dwellings, and produce were regulated in such a manner that each person possessed his own property without other seizing or occupying it. I wish your Catholic Majesty to understand the motive that moves me to make this statement is the peace of my conscience, and because of the guilt I share. For we must destroy our evil behavior because a government as we enjoyed by these natives. Perhaps this conscience made him romanticize Inca society, but Mancio Serra went on to say that the actions and abuses of the Spaniards had ruined the inhabitants, introduced bad habits, and reduced the ancient nobility to poverty. In an earlier will, he had declared that everything produced from his grant of indigenous workers, including his land estate, should belong to them, since it was once their own. He had seen and lived it all, but burdened his soul with conscience, and he believed it was a matter for the royal conscience as well. I inform your Majesty that there is no more I can do to alleviate these injustices other than by my words, in which I beg God to pardon me. Spain and Portugal created empires in the Americas by conquest and settlement. These lands, which became Latin America, were immediately drawn into a New World economy, providing silver, gold, new crops, and other goods. They also served as models and attraction for other Europeans who eventually created an Atlantic system based on plantations coerced labor, and the exploitation of mineral wealth that linked Europe, West Africa, and the Americas in terms of people, cultures, and economies. More often by violence than persuasion, the emerging hierarchy of world economic relationships shaped conditions in this new civilization for several centuries. The peoples of Spain and Portugal, often collectively called Iberians because it all came from the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, mixed with Native Americans and adopted aspects of their culture while introducing the religion, technologies, and many aspects of their culture to the indigenous peoples. Both groups were also influenced by the cultures of the slaves imported from Africa. The formative period for Latin American civilization extended from initial contacts in the 1490s, intrusions of the Iberians, especially the Castilians and the Portuguese, and by the incorporation or destruction of Native American cultures arose throughout the American continents. Much of what the Iberians did in the Americas followed the patterns and examples of their European traditions. The Native Americans who survived, although they were battered and profoundly transformed, showed a vitality and resilience that shaped later societies in many ways. What result drew on European and Native American precedents, but it was something new, the world's latest addition to the list of distinctive civilizations. Spaniards and Portuguese, from reconquest to conquest. The peoples who inhabited the Iberian Peninsula had long lived at the frontier of Mediterranean Europe. During the Middle Ages, their lands were a cultural frontier between Christianity and Islam. Conflicts created a strong tradition of military conquest and rule over peoples of other beliefs and customs. A number of Christian kingdoms emerged, such as Portugal on the Atlantic coast, Aragon in eastern Spain, and in the center of the peninsula, Castile, the largest of all. By the mid-15th century, the rulers Ferdinand of Aragon and his wife Isabella of Castile, I'm going to say Castile. I've been saying Castile, I just said Castile once. Anyway, and his wife Isabella of Castile carried out a program of unification that sought to eliminate the religious and eventually the ethnic divisions in their kingdoms. With the fall in 1492 of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom, the cross triumphed throughout the peninsula. Moved by political savvy and religious fervor, Isabella ordered the Jews of her realm to convert or leave the country. As many as 200,000 people may have left, severely disrupting some aspects of the Castilian economy. It was also in 1492, with the Granada War at an end and religious unification established, that Isabella and Ferdinand were willing to support the project of Genoese mariner named Christopher Columbus, who hoped to reach the East Indies by sailing westward around the globe. Iberian society and tradition. Like many Mediterranean peoples, the Spanish and Portuguese were heavily urban, with many peasants living in small towns and villages. That pattern was also established in America, where Europeans lived in cities and towns surrounded by a rural native population. Many commoners who came to America as conquerors sought to recreate themselves as new nobility, with native peoples at their serfs. The patriarchal family was readily adapt to Latin America, where large estates and grants of American Indian laborers provided the framework of relations based on economic dominance. The Iberian Peninsula had maintained a tradition of holding slaves, part of its experience as an ethnic frontier. In contrast to most of the medieval Europe, and African slaves had been imported from the trans-Sahara trade. The extension of slavery to America built on this tradition. The political centralization of both Portugal and Castile depended on a professional bureaucracy, usually made up of men trained as lawyers and judges. This system is worthy of comparison with the systems in China and other great empires. Religion and the church served as the other pillar of Iberian politics. Close links between church and state resulted from the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims, and these links, including royal nomination of church officials, were also extended to the New World. Spanish and particularly Portuguese merchants also shaped traditions that became prevalent in the American colonies. Portugal had been moving down the African coast since 1415, establishing trading posts rather than outright colonies. In the Atlantic islands, however, more extensive estates were established, leading to a slave trade with Africa and a highly commercial agricultural system on sugar. Brazil would extend this pattern, starting out as a trade factory, but then shifting, as in the Atlantic islands, to plantation agriculture. The chronology of conquest. The Spanish and Portuguese conquest and colonization of the Americas falls roughly into three periods during the early modern centuries. First came an era of conquest from 1492 to about 1570, map 19.1, during which the main lines of administration and economy were set out. The second phase was one of consolidation and maturity from 1570 to about 1700, in which the colonist institutions and societies took their definite form. Finally, during the 18th century, a period of reform and reorganization in both Spanish America and Portuguese Brazil intensified the colonial relationship and planted the seeds of dissatisfaction and revolt. The period from 1492 to about 1570 witnessed a remarkable spurt of human destruction and creation. During roughly a century, vast areas of two continents and millions of people were brought under European control. Immigration, commerce, and exploitation of native populations links these areas to an emerging Atlantic economy. These processes were accompanied and made possible by the conquest and destruction of many American Indian societies and the transformation of others, as well as by the introduction in some places of African slaves. Mexico and Peru, with their large sedentary populations and mineral resources, attracted the Spaniards and became the focus of immigration and institution building.